Politics is at its best in this country when people who participate further their causes by adhering to ethical standards and by practicing trust, civility, and respect in all aspects of political life. It's at its best when leaders are good role models. Politics isn't always at its best. Neither are politicians. Can anyone tell me what Anthony Weiner and David Vitter have in common? Well, one answer to that question is each won his initial primary in the late 1990s with less than 29% of the vote. And that is significant. Yet they went on to win safe seats in the Congress. Each succeeded a powerful member of Congress in a safe district, safe for his party. David Vitter won 22% of the vote in his primary in 1999 and succeeded Bob Livingston, the almost Speaker of the House, in the safest Republican district in Louisiana. Anthony Weiner succeeded Chuck Schumer in a Brooklyn-based district in New York City. As safe a Democratic district as you will find anywhere in this country. I think their behavior has something to do with what's wrong with our politics and what's wrong with our districts. They're not competitive in a two-party sense. You might find other similarities between the two. You might say that they've each engaged in Clintonian behavior. That is true of the gentleman who was almost Speaker before David Vitter from the safest first district of Louisiana. Bob Livingston was voted to be Speaker of the House by the Republican caucus several days after Newt Gingrich resigned. Newt Gingrich, where have I heard that name? And yet resigned himself from the Congress weeks later after he disclosed that he'd had extramarital affairs, and that had bothered members of his caucus. There are other things that bothered members of his caucus, but they aren't as well known. More competition, more two-party competition, or multi-party competition in Congress and in politics would help curb bad behavior. It also would help mitigate the excessively ideological behavior on the left and on the right. People wonder why people don't get involved in politics. They often consider it a dirty political game. Well, as someone who covered politics for 30 years as a journalist, I can tell you it is generally a clean game, especially here in Virginia. The problem isn't the dirt in politics. The problem is the inability of partisan forces on the left and partisan forces on the right to engage each other seriously for the public interest. Because it is often in the partisan interest of either party to continue the partisanship over finding some compromise that could further the public good. Actually, it's a clean game, and it has clean players largely. I would say 99% of the people I've covered in government and at the local and state level in Virginia have been clean players in it for the right reasons. I can name a few who weren't, but so can we all. But that's not the way the media plays the political game. The media plays the political game as entertainment tonight. In the last 20 years, the last vestiges of a line between journalism covering government and journalism covering entertainment have been washed away. We change and improve our society and the opportunities that people have in our society through politics. People who don't get involved, who consider it too dirty a game to get involved, risk losing because they aren't at the table. Virginia's rapidly changing demographics has much to do with why Virginia's politics are changing rapidly. Virginia is changing its population as it becomes more diverse, more foreign-born, and full of new and expanding cultural identities. The state's evolving demographics alone help justify increasing and improving the civics offerings that we fail to offer enough of in our public schools. Consider Virginia's population in the latest census. If I can ask for a show of hands, how many of you all were born in the state of Virginia? This is very typical. 50% of Virginians were born outside the state of Virginia. 50%. 10% of Virginians were born outside the boundaries of the U.S. 10% were born in a foreign country. 40% of those 10% who were born abroad were born in Asia. 36% were born in Latin America. 13% in Europe, 9% in Africa. This is who's moving to Virginia. This is how the demographics of Virginia are changing. The 40% of Virginians who were born outside the state were born in states largely to our north and west. Those states include Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, as well as North Carolina, California, and Texas. Those are some of the top 10 states from which Virginians have moved to become residents of Virginia. They bring their politics and their political predispositions with them when they come. A California Republican isn't necessarily the same as a Virginia Republican. A New York Democrat isn't necessarily the same as a Virginia Democrat. So the parties are in a state of changing flux as well. The top 5 countries of birth for foreign-born Virginians, 1 in every 10 of us: Mexico, El Salvador, India, Korea, and Guatemala. The voters of Virginia's present and future increasingly bring their political traditions and their political predispositions with them from far. As a member of the Virginia Commission on Civics Education, I believe that we do not teach enough civics in our public school curriculum. Voters do not know what functions of government, for example, are supposed to be federal, what functions of government are supposed to be state, and what functions of government are supposed to be provided primarily by the localities. And they especially don't know when these functions are mixed, as most of them are today. Given a desire to bring about change and give a good civic education, anyone can take a more active and useful role in the lives of Virginians. They can improve the lives of Virginians through participation at the state and local level in politics. We all have a responsibility to stay informed and be involved. As a society made up of many communities, we value individuals who choose to participate in a political process that can bring about changes if enough people have the faith and understanding to make that process work. There is no better place for citizens to become involved than at the state or local governmental effort level, because that is where lives are touched most easily and most strongly by those who participate. Virginia and the nation have enough problems to solve without the misunderstanding and paralysis that can result when people lack the faith or the knowledge to make their government work. Generally, the happiest and most successful political figures that I have covered in 30 years, from Southwest Virginia's Linwood Holton to Richmond, Virginia's Gerald Beliles to Alexandria, Virginia's John Warner, employed the civil exchange of views with members of the opposite party, who were also their friends and colleagues. In its 18 years, the Sorensen Institute for Political Leadership has become a national model for the successful bipartisan training of more than 1,300 graduates. More than 1,300 Virginians have gone through our 4 programs. I see one of them in the front row, Peppy Linden. It's great to have you. Glad you're here. And generally what these people have in common, aside from a desire to make government better and to make government work for people, is that they believe that there can be and should be discourse across party lines to formulate policy. That public policy is improved when it is not one-sided, but is agreed upon as a compromise by people from different partisan beliefs. 17 of our graduates now serve in the Virginia General Assembly. They are younger members of the House mostly. They know how to work together civilly across the aisle. I've watched these young legislators learn the ropes and sometimes defy the trend, which is sometimes enforced by the parties, to retreat into partisan camps. I know that voters love such defiance. Politics in Virginia and across the country today is changing faster than it has in decades. Virginians once were known as a traditional, sort of dignified, deferential to a fault, one-party state people. Virginians through most of the past century had one-party politics you could count on. Back when I was a boy, you knew not only who was governor, you knew who was going to be the next governor, and the governor after that. And they were all winners of the Democratic primary in June. June decided things. Well, we're getting back to that in our country today. Unfortunately, we're getting back to a situation where more than 80% of our districts are so carved as to be non-competitive in November. The real elections take place in June. And who do they look across their shoulder to be wary of in June? Do the Republicans look across their shoulder to be wary of Democrats? No. They look across their right shoulder to be wary of people who are challenging them from their own party. The same in the large numbers of Democratic districts that are so Democratic that you couldn't elect a Republican if you could find one in those districts. And that's what's wrong with our politics today. It breeds the kind of behavior that will not cooperate across party lines because the only threat to their continued incumbency is from their own party, from their own ranks, and from those who declare litmus tests for purity to the ideology of their party. Now, these litmus tests change over the years. You all know that Republicans today aren't Republicans of 20 years ago. And Democrats today are not the Democrats of 20 years ago. The litmus tests have all changed based on the groups that are the biggest contributors, largely, and the biggest participators in those parties' primaries. Now, in Virginia, we just had redistricting, and the districts got worse. They are less identifiable in terms of community of interest. They are more identifiable in terms of partisan predisposition, because legislators drew the districts based on the demographics that they had before them, the voting behavior of the voters down to the block level. They drew people they didn't want running against them out of their districts. The Democrats in the Senate willingly gave Republican voters to the Republicans in neighboring districts so that their districts would be more Democratic. The Republicans in the House of Delegates did exactly the same thing. So we've gone from having 70 non-competitive districts in November to 80 non-competitive districts in November. We've gone from having 50 districts that were reliably Republican, 60% or more, to 60 districts that are reliably Republican in the House, 50% or more, 60%. We are in a situation where it is harder and harder for politicians to meet across the middle and form compromise, which is what we teach at Sorensen, and what our graduates are finding harder and harder to accomplish because the parties are enforcing discipline. If you go to the House of Delegates in Richmond, each party member disappears an hour before the House convenes into a party caucus where the day's votes are discussed. Sometimes members of the caucus are bound to vote for a particular position on a particular bill because the leader of the party sees that the vote cannot pass unless everybody in that caucus is bound. That doesn't always happen. Usually these folks have a lot in common with each other and they are willing team players. But they will go out of their way to be team players, and especially when the caucus whips them into supporting a partisan position over a position that might actually bring about some compromise. Our politics is getting harder and harder to produce compromise. That's not what our founders intended. Our founders did not intend two partisan camps that wouldn't talk to each other. The media has a very complicit role in this because our media today is becoming more diffuse, more diverse, more dispersed, and more partisan. We are returning to the media that the founders are familiar with, which is the media of newspapers and now media outlets that are perceived as leaning one way or the other. Now, this has been true of newspapers increasingly over the last 10, 15 years. You'll hear people refer to the best newspapers in the country, such as the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, as excessively partisan. What it means is that people aren't trusting their news as much as they're designing their news sources to agree with them. Most Democrats watch cable news either on CNN or MSNBC. Most Republicans in our country today watch cable news on Fox News Network. I love watching the different cable outlets and seeing how incredibly different they are in their coverage of the news, which is fine because divergent viewpoints are good and debate is good. But what you find instead is a predominance of one side of commentators on one of the networks and a predominance of the other side of commentators on another of the networks. And often the same news event is not covered the same way across the media. And what savvy and less savvy consumers are doing is lining up their news sources with their partisan predispositions so that they are not challenged by events. If you get your news online, you're not even challenged by things that you're not looking for because you've designed what you're looking for. Can you trust bloggers? Some of them, yes. There's a blogger known as a girl in Syria, a lesbian girl in Syria, a gay girl in Syria, who turned out to be a 40-year-old American in Scotland, who for the last several months has been posting as if she were a gay person in Syria. This only became known in the last several days after this Scottish American decided to report on his blog that he had been kidnapped by the Syrian authorities, which was a believable story given what's happening in Syria today, but proved to be the undoing of his identity, the disclosure of his identity. And Americans today are finding the media, as well as politicians, less and less trustworthy. That is a big problem. That's a problem we've got to figure out how to solve. If we could have a quick exercise, show of hands, how many people in this room consider themselves predominantly Democrats? How many people in this room consider themselves predominantly Republican? Independent? It's a good showing. It's a good mix. I bet you all get your news from different sources that you choose based on your partisan predispositions. As I was saying earlier, Democrats in Virginia aren't who they were 20 years ago. When I was growing up in Northern Virginia 30, 40 years ago, Democrats were divided but ruled the state. You could have an election in June and you would know who would win in November because the primary in June would determine the winner in November. There were liberal Democrats, there were moderate Democrats, there were conservative Democrats. There were Democrats who put a premium on civil rights, there were Democrats who put a premium on maintaining the status quo. All that has changed. You won't find conservative Democrats anymore. It's like finding liberal Republicans. They have fled their party and gone over either to the other side or, where an increasing number are going, to the independent middle because they don't picture themselves meeting the partisan litmus tests that are being established for both political parties. Now, these litmus tests are very valuable as they confer partisan nominations on candidates in June, or in this year in Virginia on August 23rd. August 23rd is now the primary date in Virginia. Because we had redistricting this year, because it happens every 10 years in Virginia, like Texas, we will have small numbers of the electorate, 10, 20% if we're very, very lucky, participating in the election of candidates by the nomination process in districts across the state, more in Northern Virginia than anywhere else because both parties in Northern Virginia actually believe in primaries. The base in parties downstate sometimes believe it's more to their advantage to have a caucus or a convention. or a firehouse primary, which is an easier process for the party to control and to pay for. The 80% of our delegates will be known by August 23rd. 80% of our senators will be known by August 23rd. There will be a few competitive elections in November. Those unlucky folks will have to spend millions of dollars because all of the money will go into the competitive elections, the few competitive seats that are still competitive in November. And those seats will be fought out through an increasingly hostile media environment in November of 2011. In those competitive districts, I'll give you one example. One of them might be the new 22nd Senate District of Virginia. This district stretches just to our south from Louisa and Goochland counties to our east to Lynchburg to our south. There are 5 Republicans running in an August 23rd primary for the nomination. One of them will probably be the next senator. There is one Democrat, a 10-year veteran of the Lynchburg City Council, who has a personal fortune, who runs a company, who will be the Democratic nominee. It will be a very, very competitive election. He won't have to spend all his own money because he'll be one of 5 or 6 Senate elections across the state that will determine the makeup of the next Virginia Senate. So millions of dollars will come into this rural Virginia Senate district, and they'll come in the form of mailers and 30-second radio and TV ads that you all are more than familiar with. Basically, you take a kernel of truth and you twist it until it's unrecognizable and you attach it to your opponent. That's the way media money is spent in campaigns today. That's the way campaigns are won and lost because most voters wake up to the election in the last 2 or 3 weeks before the election occurs. The media is not covering these elections necessarily very well anymore. The Virginia General Assembly has half as many reporters covering its business today as it had 5 years ago. It has one television station. We're lucky to have it here in Charlottesville, NBC 29, which maintains a permanent news bureau in the state capitol covering state capitol government and politics. It's an ignored area, and what newspapers are doing and what radio and TV stations are doing with their news operations is they're polling their audiences. And they're finding what their audiences want in terms of news coverage, and they're providing it. And one of the lowest things on the totem pole in terms of these polling efforts is coverage of state and local government. So we end up with a situation where half of the electorate doesn't even know there's, well, first of all, they don't know what district they're in because the districts have all been changed. Everybody has new territory. And that's hard. It's both hard and an advantage for the incumbents because the incumbents, take David Toscano in Charlottesville. David has one of the safest seats in the House of Delegates. You couldn't find a Republican who could beat David Toscano in the 57th House District, just as you couldn't find a Democrat who has a decent chance of defeating Rob Bell in the 58th, the district we're sitting in right here. Yet each of them is picking up 20 to 30% or more new voters in their district as the redistricting was accomplished in May. So they have to campaign in districts that they haven't been in before. They have to go door to door. David's holding a town meeting in Cale Precinct, which is the most Democratic precinct in Albemarle that wasn't in his district, but now is in his 57th district. You know why Cale was not in the 57th before? Because that was the residence of Paul Harris. And Paul Harris had every Republican precinct in Albemarle, plus the Democratic precinct he lived in, so that he had a very safe Republican seat. Well, Rob Bell has inherited that seat, and it has become more Republican since the last redistricting. They gave up precincts like Cale, which is heavily Democratic, to the 57th. So David Toscano has all sorts of new voters who don't really know him that well, who will hopefully get to know him before November 8th. But Rob has new voters in Rockingham County. And you may ask what Rockingham County has to do with Albemarle. There's a mountain in between, or a bunch of mountains in between. The only road that connects this district is US 33, If you've been over the gap there, it's an interesting trip. It's a little slow. Most of us would take 64 over if they weren't working on the bridge down at 29. But these districts are designed now like Cree Deeds District. Cree is the senator who, since Emily Kurek, one of our first graduates at the Sorensen Institute, died of pancreatic cancer, Cree has represented the 25th Senate District. Well, Cree's district is a Democratic district that was redistricted 10 years ago by Republicans who gave all the Democrats they could to Emily Kurek because they wanted to have more Republicans in their district to the south, more Republicans to their district in the north, and they created a butterfly district that includes Albemarle, Charlottesville in the east, stretches to the West Virginia line in Allegheny County. Every Democrat they could possibly squeeze into that district, they squeezed into Emily Kurek and now Cree Deeds District. Cree's district just became a little more Republican. How did that happen? Well, Ed Houck, the incumbent in the 17th Senate District, who represents Spotsylvania and Fredericksburg, decided that his district wasn't Democratic enough. And Ed's been around the state Senate a lot longer than Cree Deeds has. So Ed got the Democrats who control the redistricting process in the state Senate to put eastern Albemarle in the 17th district, the Fredericksburg district. So eastern Albemarle will now have a new state senator regardless of who wins the election in November. It will be a competitive election. It will be one of the 6 that gets millions and millions of dollars spent in it. Ed Houck from Fredericksburg tried to get Charlottesville into his district. And Cree went to the party leadership and said, he can have eastern Albemarle, but he can't have Charlottesville. So Cree's district is slightly more Republican. It is still a Democratic performing district. Cree is still heavily favored to win re-election this November. Ed Houck has a district that chopped off the Republican northern part of Culpeper County and gave it to another senator who doesn't mind having it because he's a Republican. And Ed picked up Democratic voters from Keswick to the northern suburbs of Charlottesville. These voters don't know that they're in a Fredericksburg district now. They don't realize that. They won't know it on August 23rd because Ed Houck is the only candidate running for the Democratic nomination in the 17th Senate District. Ed Houck will win the nomination and face a tough battle against Bryce Reeves, who is a businessman from the Fredericksburg area, who is a very active Republican, well-funded, and because he occupies one of the 3 Democratic districts that is most Republican-leaning in the state, he will be tremendously well-funded going into the November elections. And eastern Albemarle will become a real battleground. I was surprised, I know Bryce because he's another Sorensen graduate. I was surprised to turn onto the bypass from Old Ivy Road where Sorensen has its offices.
Yes.
And I saw Bryce Reeves'
on the right.
Yard sign planted on the right there, and I thought, my God, somebody's discovered this is Bryce's district. There are actually 2 people in Albemarle who now know they're in Bryce Reeves and Ed Houck's competitive 17th senatorial district. It's going to be a real, real battle. We will all know them as they are defined by their opponent and as they try to define themselves prior to November. So we're 2 months later than normal for our primaries. We have more partisan districts, by and large, than we had going into this year. And who votes in the middle of August, anyway?
Who's here in the middle?
Who's here in the middle of August? Who votes in the middle of August? And the electorate isn't going to wake up to this primary until a week or 2 before, when they're bombarded in those 6 districts that actually have a competitive race. And then they will be given the choice based on the 30-second little drips and drabs that they decide to spend money on. And the mailers. The mailers are even more screamingly outlandish than the radio and television spots, because the average piece of mail that comes into a person's home is junk. They know that. They look at it for, at most, 6 or 7 seconds before they toss it where it belongs. So to become noticed, political mail has to make a claim in 6 or 7 seconds that will engage the person it's sent to actually want to read what else is written on this, usually piece of cardboard that is sent through the mail at a bulk rate. That is, in many districts, the most economical way. Although now robocalls are becoming the most economical way. How many of you love robocalls? You're going to get it. If you're lucky enough to live in a competitive district, you're going to get robocalls because you can make hundreds of them very, very cheaply. Thousands of them very, very cheaply. Tens of thousands of them very, very cheaply. And campaigns are nothing if they're not trying to find cheap ways to get information across to voters. If past redistricting trends prevail, many of the state's legislative districts will be less than competitive in November. Your choice will be on August 23rd. I hope you all vote on August 23rd if you have a race, because that will decide who your next representative will be in the Virginia General Assembly. And now I'm tired of talking and would love to get your questions and engage in Q&A. Yes, back of the room.
Yes, I was interested to hear your talking about the media, and I've often wondered about whether it functions just as an echo chamber for people who like to hear themselves and they're people who are like-minded, or whether there's some independent way that the media is or works to distort political discourse. And I was wondering, what's your opinion on commercial segmentation causing deeper divides in our discourse? For instance, mothers might care more about insurance overhaul than single fathers, and so some networks might try to cater to mothers and thus have more commercials for things like diapers and other family-related items, while other networks might care more about or cater more toward things like power tools. And how do you think that commercial...
We haven't seen it yet in terms of coverage because there is still at least a Chinese wall between the editorial side of significant news outlets and the journalistic side of significant news outlets. But those of us who watch, say, the CBS Evening News with Scott Pelley, we know every drug there is on the market for people who are over 50. Because that's who advertises on the CBS Evening News. It is increasingly becoming a segmented media outlet in terms of which audience is watching which program. The advertisers know it. The advertisers flock to those programs. Luckily, there is still enough journalistic integrity at the major news operations of our country, the major networks, that they are not totally swayed by who advertises on their program. So you have not yet seen what could happen if this trend continues, which is news coverage tailored to demographic groups. It is to some extent in the features that the networks provide on the news. You can tell if you watch a particular network that a particular feature appeals to their demographic, but the hard news coverage tends to be pretty straight in terms of how it's being covered on the major networks. In terms of analysis and talk shows, however, that's gone by the way. The experts that are on these programs are tailored to a particular political demographic. Everybody knows it, everybody expects it. CNN, which has tried to stay somewhat in the middle between MSNBC and Fox News, has suffered in the ratings because its left is being grabbed by MSNBC and its right is being grabbed by Fox News, and it is attempting to maintain the journalistic integrity of what Fox News calls fair and balanced, which isn't fair and balanced. So, yes.
What about the NewsHour, Bob?
Their demographic is even older than the CBS News demographic. So I admire people who watch the NewsHour because they are dedicated to watching good news programming that they trust will be provided in a bipartisan, nonpartisan fashion. And largely that is still true. The NewsHour is public radio and public television are going to change as their funding changes. Their funding is being less and less government provided. In Virginia, that happened this year. The governor, in one of his rare uses of the veto pen after the session, decided that public radio and public television didn't need Virginia public funds. So luckily, most of the outlets that provide good programming on public radio and good programming such as it is, there isn't very much of it locally produced on public television, have other sources and have been finding other sources of funding. And that's a good thing. Public funding for public radio and TV is drying up and will continue to dry up. Yes?
Yes, you discussed here today with regard to redistricting and basically saying that the redistricting is such that, you know, everybody winds up with a safe, you know, area for their particular party or their particular area, and that you espouse that, at least my understanding is that that is, you know, is something of a detriment, and that's kind of like, I guess it's gerrymandering, I guess is what they usually call it. I would think.
That's a polite name. In fact, gerrymandering is the term that's thrown around in the country, but it really should be called Henrymandering,
Yeah.
because Patrick Henry did it to James Madison, James Monroe rather. No, James Madison. He redistricted. He tried to redistrict James Madison out of his House district, and if it weren't for Madison and Thomas Jefferson and large amounts of booze provided to voters, he would have succeeded when he was governor of Virginia.
Well, basically, this was a precept, but the thing was that, what, you know, you basically, I know you've encouraged people to vote for the primaries, et cetera, you know, to let their voices be made known. But when it comes to the redistricting and or gerrymandering, if you want to call it, do you have an opinion on any way, because this seems to be the nature of the beast, if you will,
Very much.
that this can be addressed, you know, by the public, you know, without some way that there could be a voice, you know, some mechanism to change this?
It's a conundrum because there is very little understanding of the process. Therefore, there's very little public interest in changing the process. The public knows that gerrymandering is politically disadvantageous to competitiveness in November, and yet the public doesn't care.
Well, even if they did care, though, it's a situation that could be very difficult, you know,
In many
override
cases, it would take a
mechanism.
constitutional revision, and this has to be something that political leaders bring to the fore, because it isn't going to. I don't see it boiling up except in California, which has just changed its nominating process. California has decided to become more like Louisiana and go to a primary process that puts people on the November ballot based on how well they did in a primary, regardless of party. Louisiana's had that odd, that's how David Vitter won with 22% of the vote in the 1999 primary. He was one of two finalists, David Treen, who was actually the Republican establishment favorite to succeed Bob Livingston in Louisiana, got 28%, and the two of them went on the November ballot because the Democrat in that district got all of 11% in the primary, so he was out in November.
So there's at least 2 states that have tried to do something.
There are at least 2 states that are trying. There are several other states that have a nonpartisan redistricting process that is actually discouraging to gerrymandering. Iowa being one example. Iowa, it's relatively easy. The political traditions of the state are that you don't take the incumbent's district into consideration when you're redistricting. It's a relatively rectangular state, and you have flat land, and they have districts that make sense on the map. It's a lot easier in a state like Iowa than it is in a state like Virginia. But in Virginia, it's not even considered. It is the province of the legislature, which regards it as its ability to maintain power. So it would take it would take a gubernatorial campaign in which the governor promised to reform it and made that one of his reform platform on which he got elected with a mandate and then it would have to go through the constitutional process.
He would probably wind up with opposition from both parties.
Well, he could. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to change. Our two-party system is our two-party system for a reason. They have a chokehold on the nominations, yes.
You talked about those annoying robocalls. For many of us who are involved in local campaigns, the thing that they drag us in for is to sit there and make phone calls. Do those phone calls that we spend hours making have any impact at all?
Yes, if they're done well.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
And has well.
If they're done well, if they're done with a friendly voice who solicits useful information for the candidate or for the party, then that information is digitized and is available to the party so that they know on 3 o'clock on the afternoon of the election which party members have not come out to vote in that precinct, and they can again phone or text or use some other form of communication to remind those voters that are friendly to them that they have X number of hours before the polls close at 7 o'clock. And actually it's very useful to the parties to get that information. And that information, if the party is strong, is used to get favorable voters to the polls and can make a real difference. So it's a very valuable function when you have a functioning party. There are many parts of Virginia where you don't have a functioning party. Charlottesville, Arlington, where I'm from, you have functioning parties. There are parts of Virginia where the parties are more social than they are functional. And they don't engage in the kind of electoral behavior that gets voters to the polls. What you found in 08 with Barack Obama was a reuse, a novel use of the internet, both to encourage contributions and to encourage participation. And with his unique appeal, you got both in tremendous numbers, and yet the turnout was not that much greater than it had been in previous presidential elections. We were fortunate that there was a bump up in turnout, but there's no guarantee that the turnout is going to continue to be high next year, for example, in the presidential. Right now, how many of you all intend to watch tonight's presidential debate? There's one in New Hampshire. It is, I encourage you all to watch. CNN will cover it. The top 6 Republican candidates who are announced for the presidential nomination of their party will be speaking. They'll be entertaining questions. They'll be trying to differentiate themselves from each other. And these early attempts at showing the public who they are the only filter we have other than the campaigns themselves. So they're a little more honest and a little more testing than the campaigns themselves in terms of getting out good information about who these candidates really are. Voters in New Hampshire are lucky enough to be in a small state where they expect the candidates to come calling in their neighborhood. Voters in Virginia, that's true if you're running for a county or a city office. It's true if you're running for a House of Delegates. You can meet your candidate and get to know them. If you're a congressman, and there are only congressmen in Virginia, that's a serious flaw in our state and our nation. 19% of the people elected to elective office at the state level and above in Virginia are women. 19%. 52% or more of the electorate are women. There's a disconnect there. One of the reasons for that, and it's funny, is that women often wait to be asked to run, and run only when they feel significantly courted and asked to run. Men jump in without being asked. It's a significant difference between male and female candidates. Pepe.
With so many people running in the primary for the Senate seat, do you think that's likely to result in an independent who doesn't win the primary?
No. It's very, very hard for an independent to win an election as large as a state Senate seat. You'd have to be well-funded, and you'd have to be probably independently wealthy. You know, if you're the mayor of New York, you can do it. But not everybody has his fortune. So the party nomination process is still the only game in town. Yes?
Is there any group that's working towards having the nonpartisan redistricting being
There are groups that do favor that and do work toward it. The League of Women Voters is a group that does. They have not met with outstanding support, except that they have brought this with a business coalition to the Virginia Senate, which has unanimously endorsed legislation to make the process at least less partisan. But the Virginia Senate unanimously endorsed that, knowing that the House of Delegates would kill it the next day. So it's a game they play.
I was curious because even looking at the congressional district, I went down to, I teach scuba diving. I'm now retired, so I'm teaching scuba diving on the side. It's my fun job finally. And I go down to Lake Rawlins, which is in Petersburg.
Right.
And I was seeing Perriello signs last year. I'm going, wait a minute, it really does come all the way down here, you know, and then looked at the signs. I'm from Northern Virginia, just moved down here in September.
Well, Tom's old district, which is now Robert Hurt's district, will soon be in Northern Virginia. It will stretch from the North Carolina line, if the House plan is adopted, or anything like it, to north of I-66 in Fauquier County.
Oh, idiot.
It will be a district that no Democrat can successfully challenge Robert Hurt in. That's the way they're being drawn. The 11 congressional representatives from Virginia, all men, got together and gave their input. The 3 Democrats were happy to take more Democratic voters from the surrounding Republican districts. The 8 Republicans were happy to give up those Democratic voters to the 3 Democrats where they could. And that's the House plan. That plan is one of 2 that each House has rejected the other's plan, and we'll know in a month, maybe longer, whether or not the House plan, which I think probably has more political support because the governor is behind it, will eventually expand our district to become a US 29 district, basically from north of I-66 to Danville and Pennsylvania and the North Carolina line. You know, one thing people don't realize about Virginia is that demographics define politics. And in 1940, 3 of the most populous counties in Virginia were Pittsylvania County, surrounding Danville, Halifax County, four counties, Henry County, which surrounds Martinsville, and Wise County, which is a coal mining county in southwest Virginia. Now the most populous are Fairfax County, Loudoun County, and Prince William County. And that has completely changed the demographics of Virginia and the politics of Virginia, from where the power once resided in the south side to where it currently resides, where 1 in 3 voters in the state lives in Northern Virginia. Now the Northern Virginia voters have disadvantaged themselves because, like all good Northern Virginians, they look north. They don't look to Richmond. They don't even think about Richmond. Their media doesn't cover Richmond. They don't care about Richmond. They don't know about Richmond. All they know is their tax money disappears there. And because they don't know as much about Richmond, and they don't pay as close attention to what's happening in their state government, they can be taken advantage of by folks who do follow what's happening in state government, and whose representatives are representing people who do follow what's going on in state government. So Northern Virginians have the power, yet they are not in a position necessarily to use it because their electorate views Richmond as the Washington Post views Richmond as sort of a sleepy southern backwater, you know, down there, you know, they don't matter that much. It's Washington that counts. And that's the way politics is covered in Northern Virginia, and it's very sad for Northern Virginians. It's very good for the rest of us who want our particular pocket of Virginia to be well represented and to have power. Charlottesville has done very, very well over the last 40 years in terms of sending people to Richmond who have actually made a difference in Richmond, because they have a part of the state that, even though it's small, it still matters. If you come from Martinsville, you're finding that this area of the state once mattered 30, 40, 50 years ago, and matters so much less today that the delegate from Martinsville just had his district taken away from him and placed in Loudoun County. Now, he's not moving to Loudoun County to run for re-election. He's moving to the district west of his in Patrick County and western part of Henry County. But he was redistricted intentionally out of his district by the Republicans who have the power to do these things. They had to take districts from south side and southwest and put them in Northern Virginia. They just chose his. That's the way it works, yes.
Our delegates have a question. They're both curious and interested to know concerning the presidential election.
Yes.
And specifically the Electoral College.
Yes.
And looks like the Electoral College is kind of censoring or screening people that they want to become president rather than directly, like some other countries, being elected as a president, so they wanted some light. Yeah, and if there is any movement changing that process.
There is, but it's not significant enough yet to change the process. So we are going to have the Electoral College with us for a while. Virginia's 13 votes in the Electoral College. Every state has the number of congressmen plus the number of senators, equaling the number of representatives they have in the Electoral College who cast the ballot. There are a couple of states, Maine and Nebraska, where you can have a split vote, and the entire Electoral College from that state doesn't go the way the state goes. If the state goes by one vote in California to a D, all 43 or whatever, Electoral College members vote for the D. Same in Texas. If the state goes by one vote, it won't. It'll go by 1 million. For the R, then every member of the Electoral College in that state will vote for the R. Maine and Nebraska are the states where that's different. They vote by congressional district, and the Electoral College representative of Omaha can vote differently from the Electoral College representatives from the rest of Nebraska, and that has happened. Maine, the same thing. There are two small states, they don't matter. What the Electoral College does is it makes the state level very, very important. And there are about 18 states that are more important than all the rest of the states because they are more competitive than the rest of the states. And that's where the vast majority of the candidates' time and money and campaign attention will be spent. In those 18 states, which really boil down to about 12 states, Virginia is lucky enough to be one of those 12 now. We are lucky enough to be one of the competitive states that we get the attention of the presidential candidates on both sides. And that's a good thing. We're lucky. We're competitive. And that's because of all those people who've moved in from wherever they've moved in from, making us competitive. Thank you. Thank you for moving. Yes?
I grew up with the idea that the fourth estate press was very important to the health of the democracy.
It still is.
And how would you distinguish using the term fourth estate versus media role of television? And finally, when something, an obvious lie, is constantly put out there, such as Medicare, socialized medicine, what's the importance of the media correcting those intentional lies?
It's very important for the independent media to correct the intentional lie. And it largely takes a little bit of time for the truth to out, because the lie is told so often and so many times in a partisan context that many partisans tend to believe it. It doesn't matter what the lie is. This is what happens in our system today. And we rely on the independent media to be a check against these lies. And if people are paying attention, they learn that there is another side to the truth.
I mean, there is socialized medicine in the U.S., but even the neocons, I don't think, would undo it, and that's the Veterans Administration and all military hospitals and bases. But this isn't put out there to educate the public, because the government owns the facilities and hires the doctors, and that's
it has a particular audience.
June 30th of 2009, AARP had a wonderful list of definitions of the different health plans and so forth.
AARP is typical of groups that have become very powerful and very influential because they impart information to people that they aren't necessarily finding through the mass media. The difference between the media and the Fourth Estate is the difference between celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Civil War and celebrating the sesquicentennial. I was in Lynchburg over the weekend with our class, and the city manager of Lynchburg gave a talk, and he said, we don't celebrate the sesquicentennial of the American Civil War because nobody knows what the word means. We're celebrating the 150th anniversary. Same thing with the media and the Fourth Estate. I mean, our terminology changes, and the media is now the accepted fourth estate.
But the TV is so visual. Has that had a negative impact the way it's used?
Yeah.
It has many impacts, some of which are negative. And yet it is a very valuable teaching tool, and there are good sources of information on television. You just have to find them and pay attention to them. And it depends on how smart Americans are as consumers. We have many more choices, and some of them are more appealing than others. Some of them are more entertaining than others. That's what's happened to the news business. It's become the entertainment business.
That's why I think it's so sad that PBS and NPR aren't used more by people for the source of information from both sides or all sides.
PBS and NPR are still very, very important outlets for getting news out to the American public, and they will continue to be as they receive less and less federal money. They will still be. Thank God, Mrs. Kroc gave hundreds of millions of dollars to NPR. It's going to rely on that kind of funding. It's going to rely on corporate. It's going to rely, and corporate funding does it carry strings like our first questioner? Well, you pay attention, at least subliminally, to where your money's coming from. So there is a chance that news coverage will change as corporate funding and other funding of the media becomes more important to those media. People don't want to piss off the person who's giving them the dollars.
If corporations funded PBS and NPR more, do you think they would even have to kowtow to that, or could they keep their integrity?
I think they've done a marvelous job keeping their integrity, and yet it's always a threat. Big Ag has been a major booster and funder of public television. I'm not sure that Little Ag gets its story told as well on public television. That's my own personal, if I were to find one fault with corporate funding, tailoring what's covered. Not the way it's covered, but what is covered. What is covered and what is not covered is very, very important. And big money can drive out small money. Yes?
In terms of reducing competitiveness in elections, gerrymandering obviously plays a big role, but to what extent do you think that campaign finance laws also significantly reduce competitiveness by barring entry of third candidates who often rely on a small pool of donors to fund their campaigns?
Campaign financing is something that both parties have tried and failed to control in many parts of our political process. I personally believe that Virginia does it best. No limits, total disclosure, instant disclosure. I think that is far more valuable than what we have with McCain-Feingold, which is basically masking disclosure and forcing money to flow around some bars and find other sources. So we get the Citizens United case that says a corporation can spend as much money as it wants to as an individual and influence elections in a way that is not transparent. That is the problem. McCain-Feingold, as well-intentioned as it was, has been a detriment to transparency in political funding. And no matter what system the parties set up, what system the parties controlling Congress and the state legislatures set up, it's going to favor the two parties. So the system that says total disclosure and instant disclosure is, I think, the best system. Very imperfect because any individual can contribute gobs and gobs and gobs of money, but at least that individual and his interests may be known, which is the disinfectant effect that keeps the process a little bit honest. Yeah.
Yes, but I mean, coming off of that, are there really that many citizens out there, even the ones who actually care about politics and vote, who pay attention to the disclosures? And at that point, doesn't that make the whole full disclosure plan ineffective just because of our ignorance?
The parties pay total attention to the disclosures. The campaigns pay total attention to disclosures, and what media we have left covering campaigns pays total attention to the disclosures, because as someone who covered elections in Virginia for 30 years, the lesson we all learned from Watergate is follow the money. Find out where it's coming from, why it's being given, and that is a major part of any honest campaign coverage. Once that disappears, you may be right. It will matter less, and disclosure will be important but not as valuable. One more question in the back. Two more questions.
All right, thanks. Well, I was very interested by you saying earlier that half the population of Virginia has come from outside the state and that they import certain trends. So I was wondering, what do you think is the most helpful trend that we might not know about that's coming from outside the state to improve our politics?
I think Virginia, more than most states, is inhabited by people who believe in innovation and entrepreneurial success. We are very lucky to live in a state that rivals California on a smaller scale for the use of the information technology that is becoming more and more a part of our economy. Northern Virginia doesn't realize it, but because it looks north at Washington and doesn't look at Richmond. But Northern Virginia, which is where most of these out-of-state Virginians initially locate, and then we move south, is an entrepreneurial garden and a garden of business innovation, both for the government sector, which largely funds its businesses, and for the private IT sector, which is thriving in Northern Virginia and needs to thrive and is starting to thrive in other parts of the state. I think we're very fortunate that we are no longer a sleepy southern backwater, which was how V.O. Key described Virginia in 1949 as being a museum piece. Our politics was described as a museum piece because it was so tightly controlled by a small bird organization that basically, from the courthouse to the White House, wanted to control every aspect of Virginia politics. That's Governor Byrd, who served in the late 1920s and then became Senator Byrd, who controlled the politics until the 1960s, resided in a small town in Clark County, Berryville, and called the shots from Berryville. Well, now Berryville is in the middle of the IT sector of Virginia, which has bled out from Fairfax and Arlington and Loudoun, and is still bleeding out into other parts of the state. So that Winchester and, believe it or not, Danville and Lynchburg are becoming IT centers. I think we're very fortunate that our immigrants have been those entrepreneurial types, as well as folks who believe in serving government and public service. Yes?
Both audience and you mentioned about the radio, television, and advertising. What do you think about the democracy now with Amy Goodman, and since they are not taking money from anybody, you think they are fair and balanced?
Oh boy. I think there are many people in our media who are fair and balanced. Not the ones who call themselves fair and balanced necessarily, but there are many people in our media who are fair and balanced, and are in it for the right reasons, aren't necessarily as big as they once were. Our media is changing faster than our politics is changing, and our politics is changing pretty fast. So where our media will be in 5 years is a big question. Newspapers are still cutting coverage, still cutting news holes, still cutting staff. Radio stations have largely followed the same business model: shrink and hope you survive, which is hardly an inducement to buy their product or listen. TV is an explosion of different sources. Everybody has a smaller share of the pie. So it's truly American, it's truly competitive. And the good will find good followings if enough people know where they are. If they can get the word out that they are providing a valuable product, their numbers will grow. But right now the funding is so tenuous at every level. NPR all the way down to the local TV, local Republican media, that, you know, the parties and the cities and counties in Virginia are now their own news outlets. They're their own news operations. They have to be. You can't rely on 3 networks and 2 newspapers to get the word out anymore. So the sources of news are much wider and much shallower. And if you're in information technology in the news business, you want to work for a government or a nonprofit, because they will have an audience, they will have, the city of Charlottesville and the county of Albemarle have seen their news operations grow. Their news operations control a lot of what comes out in the public media, and they provide their own media now. Government news, unfortunately, is becoming a bigger thing because there is less of a healthy, thriving private news sector. It's all scrambling to try to find a niche. One more question. Anyone? Yes?
How do you think the internet affects our news, our information? Consider what's happened in other countries with cell phones and information that people get, you know, and yet you look at something like Facebook, which is nonsense, that collects people for no reason. It's entertainment, I guess.
Well, it's a valuable communications tool, sharing, finding people. The internet is largely how people under 30 find their news. Those of us over 30 like to hold a newspaper in our hands. I have 3 daughters under the age of 30. They wouldn't pick up a newspaper if you handed it to them. They get it on the internet. They're well read. They read the New York Times. They read the Washington Post, but they don't pay for it.
So what is the internet? That's good.
The internet is a good source of news if you design good news sources on the internet. I mean, and there are many good news sources on the internet. There are many more than there were 5 years ago. The trouble is people are designing their own information to feed their own preferences and prejudices and party predispositions, to be alliterative about it. So we're in a state of flux where there's a giant competition on the internet for people to get their news so that they can eventually make a profit on their advertising. They aren't yet. They aren't making that profit on their advertising yet. But they will. They know they will. They're very valuable outlets that just aren't turning a profit yet. Whereas the old media, the newspapers that thought that having a newspaper in your hand was everything, are still looking for a business model that will accommodate advertising on the internet because they've lost 2/3 of their advertising to the internet. So I'm sorry if I haven't been optimistic, but we live in a good place in a very interesting time, as the Chinese would say, and we're lucky to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much.